She had 3 children who had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. The man standing in her doorway was not there out of charity. He was there because her late husband had owed him a debt she could not pay. This is not a story about a woman rescued from her circumstances. It is a story about 2 people who arrived at the same crossroads carrying different kinds of hunger, and what happened when neither of them looked away. The morning Nora Calloway signed the paper, the wind was pushing hard off the plains and the kitchen smelled of flower water and nothing else. She had stretched the last of the cornmeal into something she called porridge and watched her children eat it without complaint. Elias, 9 years old and already wearing the careful expression of a boy who understood more than she wanted him to. May, 6, who ate with focused seriousness and did not ask for more. And Thomas, 4, who did not yet know to be ashamed of the sound his stomach made. She had sent them outside before the man arrived. The debt was $340. Her husband, Daniel, had borrowed against the farm equipment 2 winters ago, promising a harvest that the drought had swallowed whole. He had died in March, a riding accident on the Frozen Creek Road, and left her his name, his land, and his obligations. The creditor's office in town had given her 60 days. Those 60 days had ended yesterday. The man who came through her door was not the creditor. His name was Cade Harlow. He owned the Broken Spur Ranch, 14 miles northeast of her homestead, and according to the paper she now held, he had purchased her debt from the lending office 3 weeks prior. He did not explain why. He was tall, dark-coated, and he held his hat in his hands with the deliberate stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was the only thing that kept him from losing his temper in situations that required patience. He looked around her kitchen once. His eyes moved across the empty larder shelf, the cold stove, the single cup of flower water sitting beside the wash basin. His face did not change. "You understand what the paper says," he told her. It was not a question. "I understand it." She set it on the table between them. "You hold the debt. I cannot pay it. The farm reverts to your name within 30 days unless alternative terms are arranged." "That's right. And you've arranged alternative terms." He looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were the particular gray of an overcast sky, not unkind, but not warm. "I need a housekeeper and a woman who can manage accounts. My foreman left in February. My cook died in April. I've got 8 ranch hands, 300 head of cattle, and a ledger that's going to strangle me by September if someone doesn't straighten it. You're offering employment. I'm offering a room. For you and your children, meals from my kitchen, $20 a month against the debt principal. At that rate, you'll clear the $340 in 17 months. He said it without inflection, like a man reading from a supply list. You'll manage my household accounts, preserve food for winter, and handle whatever the ranch kitchen requires. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Elias's voice. He was teaching May some game involving stones and a line drawn in the dirt. My children go where I go, she said. I know that. They are not labor. Something moved briefly across his face, and then was gone. I'm not looking for labor from children, Mrs. Calloway. I'm looking for someone who can keep my books from collapsing before the fall roundup. She looked at the paper. She looked at the empty shelf. She thought of the porridge and the careful way her son had not looked at his empty bowl. When do we leave? She said. He had not expected her to agree so quickly. She saw that plainly, the slight adjustment of his posture, the pause before he answered. Tomorrow morning. First light. She nodded once, and he put his hat back on and walked out. She did not cry. She had used up crying in March. The drive to the Broken Spur took the better part of the morning. She sat on the wagon bench beside Cade with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the country change as they moved northeast, the homestead plots giving way to open range, the grass running long and pale gold in the autumn wind, the sky enormous and indifferent overhead. She had lived in this territory for 7 years and had never ridden this far out from town. Daniel had always said they didn't need to go farther than they had. Thomas fell asleep across her lap halfway there. May sat in the wagon bed behind them, watching the landscape with the careful attention of a child cataloging a new world. Elias sat beside his sister and said nothing, which was more telling than if he had spoken. Her son went quiet when he was working something out, and she suspected he was working out quite a great deal. Cade did not speak for most of the drive. Once, when the wagon jolted over a dry creek crossing and Thomas stirred in her lap, he slowed the horses without being asked and said nothing about it after. The broken spur sat against a long ridge of low hills, its buildings weathered silver gray from years of sun and wind. The house was larger than she had expected, 2 stories of solid timber with a wide porch and an iron pump in the yard that was, miraculously, still functional. The kitchen was cold when she arrived, but it was real, a proper iron range, a full larder that held beans and salt pork and several unmarked canning jars, a work table long enough to roll pastry on. After 4 days of flour water, it felt like a foreign country. Cade Harlow showed her the room, one large room at the back of the ground floor, with a window facing east and a sleeping loft above it, accessible by wooden rungs nailed to the wall. Elias immediately climbed up to inspect it. May stood in the doorway, holding Thomas's hand, and looked at the real bed and the wool blanket folded at its foot. "Is this ours?" May said. "Yes," Nora told her. May nodded solemnly, as though accepting a business arrangement. Cade was already in the hallway. "Supper's your first obligation," he said, without looking back. "Hands eat at 6. She found 8 men eating cold biscuits left from 2 days prior when she walked into the kitchen. They looked at her with the frank, measuring stares of men who had been without a cook for weeks and were not certain whether to be grateful or skeptical. She did not introduce herself. She built a fire in the range, inventoried the larder in 12 minutes, and put a pot of beans with salt pork on by 4 o'clock. She found dried onion and a jar of something that turned out to be chokecherry preserves. She made biscuits, real ones, with lard and buttermilk, and put them in the oven while the beans simmered. At 6 o'clock, 8 men sat down to a meal that was plain but hot and sufficient. Not one of them spoke for the first several minutes. Cade ate at the far end of the table. He did not comment on the food, but she noticed, because she was watching carefully in the way a woman watches a man who holds her debt, that he ate 2 helpings of beans and 3 biscuits, and that when he rose from the table, he paused at the kitchen doorway for a moment before he continued on. She fed her children afterward, at the kitchen table alone. Elias ate with the focused intensity of a boy who had been hungry for too many days running. Thomas fell asleep with a biscuit in his hand. May ate every bean on her plate and then looked up at Nora with an expression of such plain relief that Nora had to look away at the window until she could arrange her face properly. The plains outside were going dark, the sky turning the deep bruised orange of a high plains sunset. A hawk crossed the window. The range crackled. She had not saved them. She had made an arrangement, but her children had eaten. For now, that was enough. The ledger was worse than Cade had implied. She found it on the 3rd morning, sitting on the desk in what he called the office, a narrow room off the main hall with a single window and a smell of old paper and tobacco. The book was a heavy cloth-bound thing, its pages crowded with figures in 2 different hands. She recognized immediately that the accounting had been done in 2 separate systems that did not communicate with each other. Daniel had done the same thing with their farm books, and she had spent one long winter untangling it. She spent that first day building a parallel ledger on blank paper she found in the desk drawer, transferring figures, noting discrepancies. By evening, she had identified 4 separate errors that amounted to $62 in phantom expenditures, money recorded as spent that could not be traced to any real purchase. She brought it to Cade after supper, setting her parallel sheet beside his original ledger on the table. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. His finger moved down the columns. The lamp threw yellow light across his hands, rough-knuckled, ink-stained at the right forefinger, a thin scar running along the back of his left wrist. $62, he said. $62.14. She indicated the final column. If those 4 entries are corrected and the May payroll is reconciled against the head count for that week rather than the head count from March, your actual position is better than the ledger suggests. You're not as close to the edge as you thought. He was quiet. He looked at her paper and then at his and then at her. How long did this take you? 1 day. My last foreman spent 3 weeks on the May accounts and still got them wrong. She did not say anything to that. She did not need to. He picked up her parallel sheet and read it again, more slowly this time. Outside, a coyote called once from somewhere beyond the ridge. and the ranch was quiet enough that they could both hear it plainly. "I'll want the June figures by end of week," he said at last. "You'll have them by Thursday." He nodded once, a short, deliberate motion, and that was all. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who were underestimated, men who did not yet know what they were coming to understand. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now. She moved through the ranch days with the methodical focus of someone who cannot afford to be inefficient. She rose before the hands, lit the range, and had coffee and biscuits ready by the time boots sounded on the porch. She managed the kitchen inventory with a running list she kept folded in her apron pocket. She preserved 6 quarts of wild plum jam from fruit Elias found along the creek. She treated a ranch hand's infected boot blister with a poultice of plantain leaf and clean linen, having learned the technique from an older neighbor woman back home. The infection drained in 2 days. The hand, a young man named Robbie who could not have been more than 17, told the others at supper that she had likely saved his foot. Cade said nothing, but she noticed him watching from the barn door one afternoon when she showed Elias how to split kindling properly, left hand back, right hand steady, let the maul do the work. She did not acknowledge him watching. She showed her son the technique twice more until Elias had it, and then she carried the split wood to the porch box without looking toward the barn. 2 evenings later, she was in the root cellar taking inventory when she heard boots on the cellar stairs. She turned, expecting Robbie. He sometimes helped her carry jars up, but it was Cade, ducking his head under the low beam. The cellar was close and smelled of earth and dried herbs. He filled the narrow space in a way that made her uncomfortably aware of the distance between them. "You found the wild plum grove," he said. "Elias found it, along the East Creek bend." He looked at the row of sealed jars. "That grove's been there 8 years. Nobody ever put it to use before." She turned back to her inventory list. Waste is expensive. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her the same way he had looked at the parallel ledger, with the careful attention of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured. "There's a barrel of crab apples behind the smokehouse," he said finally. "Windfalls from last week." She wrote another number on her list. "I'll see to them tomorrow." His boots sounded on the stairs, and then he was gone, and the cellar smelled again only of earth and dried thyme. By the second week, she had a system for the kitchen inventory that allowed her to plan meals 3 days in advance. By the third week, she had the June accounts reconciled and 2 months of projected expenditures laid out in a clear table that showed Cade exactly where his shortfalls would occur before the fall roundup. She sat with him in the office on a Thursday evening and walked him through it, pointing to figures, explaining the projections. He asked precise, intelligent questions. She answered them without performance. The lamp burned down while they talked, and neither of them moved to trim it. A neighbor named Walt Greer stopped by on the Friday of the third week, riding in from his spread 2 miles east. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a direct gaze and the easy comfort of someone who had known Cade Harlow for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she poured without being asked, and watched her move through the kitchen with the frank appraisal of a man observing something unexpected. When she had gone to the root cellar for the cream, she heard him say to Cade through the open window, "That woman is running this place like she was born to it." She heard Cade's silence more clearly than she would have heard any answer. It was on the 23rd day that she first understood the shape of the trouble. She had ridden to town with Robbie to collect supplies from the mercantile, a straightforward errand, an hour each way. The mercantile was run by a man named Aldous Fitch, who had gray mutton chop whiskers and the careful smile of someone perpetually calculating margins. He had known Daniel. He had held a small note against their farm as well, a note, she now knew, that Cade had also purchased. Fitch greeted her with an excess of warmth that felt immediately wrong. He filled her supply order, flour, salt, lamp oil, black thread, and then, as she was signing the account ledger, he said very casually, "I suppose Harlow knows what he has in those Callaway acres." She did not look up from the ledger. "He holds the debt. More than that now. I heard the deed transferred as part of the arrangement. He let that sit. Rich bottom land along that East Creek. Good water rights. A man could triple his herd if he folded those 40 acres into the broken spur." He smiled his careful smile. Practical decision on his part. Taking in a widow and her children makes a man look generous, and it costs him nothing if the underlying property is worth what I hear it is. She signed the ledger. She took the supply box from the counter. She thanked him in a voice that revealed nothing, walked out into the white noon light, and stood beside the wagon for a moment with her hand on the sideboard and the hot sun on the back of her neck, thinking. She had not known about the deed. The paper Cade had shown her said nothing about the deed. It mentioned the debt, the terms, the household arrangement. She lifted the box into the wagon without help. She thought about the parallel ledger. She thought about the crab-apple barrel. She thought about the way he had stood in the root cellar and named the grove as if he were offering her something. She thought, perhaps. And then she thought, perhaps not. She had been wrong about a man's intentions before, and it had cost her everything. She would not assume. She would watch, and she would find the deed. She found it the following Tuesday. She had been reorganizing the office files, with Cade's knowledge at his request, because the filing system was in as much disorder as the original ledger, and in a manila envelope behind the property tax receipts, she found 3 documents. The first was the original debt note. The second was the amended terms she had signed. The third was the deed transfer, dated the same day as the amended terms, recording the 40 Callaway acres as collateral held in trust, not transferred outright, but held. The language was specific, held in trust, revocable upon debt clearance, with full title returning to Nora Callaway or her designated heirs upon final payment of the principal. He had not taken her land. He had secured it against the debt, which was standard practice, but the title remained hers. She sat with the document in her lap for a long time. The office was warm and smelled of old paper and the faint sweetness of the honeysuckle she had planted in the window box 3 days prior, because the window faced south and it seemed a waste not to use it. She put the deed back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in its place. She returned to the accounts. She put the deed back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in its place. She returned to the accounts. She did not ask him about it. But something in the particular quality of her silence around him shifted, and if he noticed, and she believed he noticed most things, he did not name it. That evening she made salt pork with roasted crab apples and cornbread, baked hard on the bottom the way ranch hands preferred it. She listened to the men at the long table, their talk of cattle prices and the coming roundup, the stretch of dry weather expected through September, the new fencing that needed posting along the south pasture. She said little. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who understood that knowing what a household needed before it was asked was worth more than any number of conversations about it. After supper, Robbie lingered while she cleared the table. He was a good-natured young man, red-haired and earnest, with the self-conscious gratitude of someone who remembered owing someone a favor. "Ma'am," he said, stacking the tin plates for her, "that foot's near as good as new. I told my mother in my letter that you fixed it. She wanted me to say thank you proper. Tell her it was plantain leaf and clean linen," Nora said. "She'll know what to do if it happens again." He nodded, satisfied. "Then, Mr. Harlow was asking me this morning how the accounts were going. I told him I wouldn't know, that you were the one to ask." He paused. He looked like he already knew the answer. Just wanted to hear someone else say it. She did not respond to that, but she carried it with her through the evening, the same way she carried the deed language and the root cellar conversation and the crab-apple barrel, each small thing another data point in the picture she was slowly assembling. It was Walt Greer's wife, Mabel, who named it for her. Mabel came for a visit on a Wednesday afternoon, riding in on a small mare with a basket of late summer squash, and the open, interested expression of a woman who enjoyed knowing exactly what was happening in the surrounding county. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair and hands that had planted and harvested and mended for 4 decades, and she looked at Nora with the particular warmth of someone who recognized a woman carrying more than she had been given credit for. They sat on the porch with coffee while the children played in the yard. Mabel watched them for a while without speaking. "Cade Harlow hasn't had anyone in that kitchen in 4 months, she said finally. "You'd think a man who lost his wife would get harder. He got quieter instead. There's a difference." She looked sideways at Nora. "He doesn't talk about her, but you can see it in how he keeps that house, like a man who doesn't believe anything good is meant to stay." Nora looked at her coffee cup. "He watches your children," Mabel said. when he thinks no one is looking. She did not say anything to that. I'm not telling you what to feel, Mabel said. I'm telling you what I see. A woman who has pulled herself straight under a weight that would have bent most people, and a man who doesn't know yet that he's been looking for a reason to stop being careful. She stood, brushing her skirt. The squash will keep 2 weeks in the root cellar. She walked to her horse, then paused with her foot in the stirrup and looked back. He called you by your first name last week. Walt told me. Said it like it surprised him to hear himself do it. She rode away before Nora had formed an answer. The trouble arrived on the last Thursday of August, in the form of a man named Roland Fitch, Aldous Fitch's younger brother, who appeared at the ranch gate in the late afternoon with 2 companions and a folded document that he presented to Cade with the practiced ease of a man who had delivered similar papers before. Nora was at the kitchen window when they rode in. She watched Cade take the document. She watched his face while he read it, the particular stillness that came over a man trying not to show that something had hit him somewhere soft. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the porch. The document, she learned later from the copy Cade dropped on the office desk, was a formal challenge to the debt assignment. Roland Fitch was claiming that the original note had contained a clause, a handwritten addendum on the final page, specifying that the debt could only be reassigned to a third party with the creditor's office's explicit written consent, and that Cade had obtained the assignment without that consent, making the entire arrangement invalid. If the arrangement was invalid, the original 60-day foreclosure clock reset. As of that notice, Nora had 15 days to pay the full $340, or the homestead would revert to the lending office, which the Fitch brothers, it emerged, had quietly purchased a controlling interest in 2 months prior. She sat in the office with the document for 2 hours. She was not panicking. Panic was a luxury for women who had other options. She was thinking, methodically, the way she did the accounts, moving through the facts available to her and testing each one for weight. The addendum language was specific enough to be real. The legal structure was sound, if the addendum was genuine. But something about the ink sat wrong in her memory. She had read enough documents in enough different conditions to know that a handwritten clause on a typewritten instrument was unusual, and that men who fabricated legal challenges were rarely clever enough to mitigate every variable. She opened the desk drawer and found a magnifying glass she had noticed 3 days prior while reorganizing. She held it over the addendum paragraph in the lamplight and looked for a long time. Different ink. The difference was subtle. The addendum ran slightly darker, bluer, where the rest of the document had the faded brown-black of a ribbon that had been in service for several months. And the paper. She had seen the original copy Cade held. She had filed it herself. The original was on thick county bond stock. This challenge document's addendum page, she now saw, was fractionally thinner. She went to the filing cabinet and retrieved Cade's original copy. Cade found her there after supper. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and looked at her with the expression of a man preparing to say something about cutting losses. "Don't," she said, before he could. He paused. "Don't tell me it's straightforward," she said. "And don't tell me there isn't a path through it, because I've been reading the document and there is one." She turned the paper toward him and pointed to the addendum paragraph. "This is handwritten in a different ink than the rest of the document. The original note was typewritten. I've seen the copy you have. This addendum is not in it." He came into the room and leaned over the desk. She could feel the warmth of him near her shoulder. He read the paragraph she was indicating. "Different ink," he said. "Different ink. And the handwriting is not consistent with the signature at the bottom of the original, which I can demonstrate if we have both documents side by side." She had already retrieved his copy of the original from the file. She placed them on the desk together. "Look at the capital R in Roland Fitch's name on the filing notice. Then look at the capital R in the addendum. Same hand." He was quiet. "They added it after the fact," she said. "This is a fabricated clause, and I can prove it with both documents and a statement from the original lending officer, who I suspect did not write this addendum and may not know it exists." He straightened and looked at her. For a long moment he said nothing. The lamp between them threw his face half into shadow. "You can prove this," he said. "I need 2 days and a witness. Someone in town whose word carries weight. Walt Greer's been on the county land board for 12 years. Then, I need Walt Greer, both documents and the original lending officer. She folded her hands on the desk. Can you arrange the meeting? He looked at her for another long moment, the kind of looking that had nothing to do with the documents. He said her name. Nora, not Mrs. Calloway. The first time, quiet and without ceremony, as if he'd been holding it back long enough that it came out before he could decide whether to let it. They both heard it. I'll ride to Walt's tonight, he said. He left before she could respond, and she sat in the warm lamplight with her hands folded and her heart doing something careful and unannounced in her chest. He rode out within the hour. She heard his horse on the yardstones, and then the sound of hooves fading north across the plain, and then the quiet of the ranch at night, crickets, the creak of the porch, Thomas talking in his sleep from the back room. She worked until midnight preparing her case. The meeting was held 2 days later in the lending office, in the presence of the original officer, a man named Sutter, who turned out to be quietly, furiously angry about the addendum, Walt Greer, Cade, and Nora. She presented both documents side by side. She pointed to the ink discrepancy, the capital R comparison, and a third detail she had found the night before. The addendum's paperweight was lighter than the rest of the document, suggesting a page replacement rather than an addition. Sutter confirmed he had not written the addendum and had never seen it before that morning. He said it flatly, with the particular fury of a man whose professional integrity had been quietly borrowed without his consent, and he said it in front of witnesses. Walt Greer confirmed that the original note, of which he had a witnessed copy in his own files from when he had co-signed a related land matter 2 years prior, contained no such clause. Roland Fitch attempted to speak. Walt Greer's look silenced him in a way that required no words. The challenge was formally invalidated by the end of the afternoon. Roland Fitch and his companions left town before supper. Aldous Fitch would hear about it before nightfall and have the sense to keep his assessments to himself going forward. She and Cade rode back to the ranch in the same silence they had ridden to town in, deliberate, weighted, full of the particular quality of two people who had just done something difficult together and had not yet decided what to make of that. Halfway home, with the plains running gold on both sides of the wagon road and the first clouds of evening building over the western ridge, he said without looking at her, "You prepared that case in 2 nights. I had the documents. You had what everyone else had. You built something different from it." She looked at the road ahead. Daniel used to say I had a legal mind. He meant it as an observation. He didn't know what to do with it. There was a long pause. The wagon wheel found a rut and she steadied herself with her hand on the benchboard. His hand was close. She did not move hers. "It's useful," Cade said, "on a ranch this size." She turned to look at him. He was still watching the road, but the line of his jaw had shifted, softened, just fractionally, in the way she had learned to read across 31 days. "It is," she agreed. Neither of them said anything more, but she did not move her hand from the benchboard, and neither did he. On the porch that evening, the sky turning the pale gold of an early September dusk, Cade stood beside her while the children played in the last of the light. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The air smelled of dry grass and the distant edge of rain coming down from the north. "You built that case in 2 days," he said. "I had the documents. Other people had the documents." She looked at the plains stretching out before them, the long blue shadow of the ridge running east. "Failing is expensive," she said. "I can't afford it." He was quiet. Then, "Neither can I." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the horizon, not at her, and she could see the thing in his face that he had not yet said, the careful, guarded quality of a man standing at the edge of something, and not yet willing to name the edge. "The debt," she said. "The 17 months, I'm not talking about the debt." The sentence landed between them and neither of them moved. Elias called something from the yard. May had knocked over the stone game and was protesting the unfairness of it, and the spell did not break so much as expand to include the children, the porch, the smell of coming rain, the lamp already lit in the kitchen behind them. She said his name then. Not Mr. Harlow. Cade. Plain and unadorned, the way she said things she meant. He turned. She did not move toward him, and he did not move toward her. But his hand came off the porch railing and found hers beside it, a simple, deliberate contact, his rough fingers covering her hand completely, and he held it without saying anything, looking at the same horizon she was looking at. Thomas toddled up the porch steps and pressed himself against her legs without asking permission, the way 4-year-olds do when they are tired and trust is self-evident. She felt Cade's hand tighten slightly around hers. She felt him breathing. "The arrangement," she said quietly. "The original terms. I know what I said. I want to know if you still mean them." He looked down at her then. The last of the daylight was in his eyes, turning them not gray, but something warmer. "The arrangement's the same," he said, "except I'd like to change one term." She waited. "The debt," he said. "I'd like to cancel it." She shook her head because she had her dignity and she intended to keep it. 17 months, as agreed. His mouth curved just slightly, just barely, the almost smile she had catalogued across 31 days. "Then, let me be here for all 17 of them." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she read ledgers, not for what was declared, but for what was true underneath. He was not promising her a grand thing. He was promising her a plain one, presence, continuance, the daily fact of him. A man who fed the stove in the morning and asked precise questions and held her land in trust and said her name like it cost him something to keep it contained. She turned her hand over beneath his, palm to palm. 17 months, she said. Then we renegotiate. His hand closed around hers fully. Thomas had fallen asleep against her hip. May was shouting something about the Stone Game's rules. Elias was laughing. The first rain hit the porch roof softly, and the plains turned the deep silver of a frontier evening, and neither of them went inside. She had not asked to be saved. She had asked for a fair arrangement and done the work it required. He had not offered charity. He had offered terms and then, slowly, without announcing it, offered more than terms. What they had built across those 31 days was not a rescue. It was a reckoning. Two people who had survived separately, discovering that surviving together was a different country entirely. "Tell me, did you feel the moment he said her name, or did you know before that it was already decided? Leave your answer in the comments below." I read everyone. She proved that competence is its own kind of love letter. He proved that a man who respects what a woman can do will follow her into 17 months without hesitation. Tell me, would you have turned that deed over and confronted him, or trusted the documents and said nothing? Leave your answer below. Next time, a woman named Ada Voss arrives at a Wyoming cattle station carrying her dead sister's name, her sister's child, and a marriage license made out to a man who has no idea his bride is not the woman he agreed to wed. Subscribe now so you do not miss what happens when she walks through that door.